You have called to us the life of faith. You have called to us the life of faith.
O Lord, our gracious God, we give you thanks for your faithful record of steadfast love and sustenance of your church, of blessing it when it is faithful, of reforming it when it has not been. We thank you for the work that you did by raising up the reformers and spreading the truth of the gospel to so many places, so that we too might know that now. And we pray, Lord, that you will continue always to reform your church and to draw it back again and again to the great and gracious truth of the gospel. We thank you especially, Lord, for those pioneers who brought that truth and planted it here in Hutchinson, and that by your Holy Spirit you have sustained this congregation of believers now for these 150 years. So as we learn that story and give thanks for it, we pray that you would continue to guide and propel us into the future, that we may continue to preserve and to promote this heritage for Jesus' sake. In his holy name we pray. Amen. All right, when we think about the Reformation, most people know that it began in Germany. So Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, Luther's ruler, Frederick the Wise, the original, the one when the Reformation began, they were all Germans. Located mostly in electoral Saxony, which is in kind of southeastern Germany, was part of the old East Germany before the nation was reunited here a number of years ago. So we know places like Wittenberg and Heidelberg. That map is too big to show those little towns, but they're all within Germany. And many Reformation histories rarely move beyond Germany. That's kind of like the whole story right there. But very early on, the Reformation began to move north, particularly into the Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland. And while the Roman Catholic Lutheran conflict raged in Germany for decades, with warfare, with all sorts of trouble, the move of the Reformation into the Nordic countries was mostly painless. It was very smooth and just sort of took over. And we'll see one of the reasons why that is a little bit later on. Now, I'm sure you all know enough about the Reformation to know that it was mostly, oh, there are guys. Forgot to click on them. Luther, Melanchthon, and Frederick. The Reformation was driven chiefly by theology, by Luther's rediscovery of the gospel, and the way that the church had disguised that and almost lost it under this accretion of teachings that had really gotten away from it. And Luther's brilliant biblical theological scholarship really led the way, got it going, and drove it in the right direction. But very quickly, alongside the theology, there was a political and social piece to it as well. Partly because church and state were totally entwined. There's no separation there whatsoever. Partly because Christianity was so baked into the cake of European society that you could not change one piece of it without changing all of it. They were really inseparable in that way. So it wouldn't have occurred to anyone then to separate these factors. You know, that somehow you could keep the theology piece sort of off by itself. It was all tied up together inescapably. Well, of these two features, the Reformation in Denmark and other northern areas was due more to political factors. The government got behind it, and that made all the difference. Now again, what Luther taught and published led the way. The government would never have made the move if they weren't convinced it was the right thing to do. But the actual switch from Catholicism to the Lutheran churches was almost entirely political, driven by political forces. Now, Denmark was particularly open to the Reformation due to geography. You see the northern tip of Germany right here, and then right up the peninsula of Jutland, and then the islands that make up Denmark. In fact, this area was the duchy, that is, they had a duke, the Duchy of Schleswig-Holstein. And that moved back and forth between Danish control and German control. So it was a kind of a fluid border. And so as the Reformation just took over Germany, it just naturally flowed up into Denmark. It was almost inevitable. Now, perhaps the earliest Danish Lutheran teacher was a man named Hans Tausen. Lived at roughly the same time as Luther. Luther was born in 1483, so he was a little older, and died sooner in 1546. Tausen was a monk originally, as Luther was, but he was also a scholar, as many monks were, and he had gone to Wittenberg to study. So he was persuaded by Luther's teaching about the gospel. So then he went back to Denmark and started teaching this stuff that he had learned in Wittenberg. And at the time, it wasn't all that well received. So they sent Tausen off to Viborg, way out in the middle of Jutland, where they thought he couldn't do any real damage. Copenhagen, is way over here, almost to Sweden, on the very east side of the island. So Viborg, I mean, this is like Pumpkin Center. They're sending him off where they figure he'll just be lost in obscurity. But Tausen took on the challenge. He went to Viborg, and he turned it into a Lutheran city, through and through, and actually remained a very influential leader, theologically, ecclesiastically, that is in the church in Denmark. It is interesting to me that although Tausen was a much more significant leader of the Reformation, that you don't hear his name much. The Danes love St. Ansgar. St. Ansgar churches all over the place. Even though he wasn't even, didn't play that big a role in Christianizing Denmark, Tausen you almost never hear of. But he really was the pioneer of bringing the Reformation to Denmark. Now, one of the reasons that Tausen probably survived, because some reformers didn't, they were either imprisoned or beheaded or burned at the stake or whatever. One of the reasons he survived was because King Christian II was also interested in the Reformation. He was also intrigued by these teachings of Luther and was being persuaded by them. Now, Christian II was a strong leader in many ways, had a lot of, he was assertive, but he was also indecisive. He had, once he made up his mind, he knew what to do, but he had a hard time getting there. As you see, he ruled from 10 years, 1513 to 1523. Right in the middle there, 1517, was when the Reformation launched with the posting of the 95 Theses. So it's right during this period of ferment in Germany that Christian II is ruling Denmark. As one expression of his interest in what Luther was doing, Christian II brought Luther's translation of the Bible up into Denmark. Even though it was German, it wasn't Latin anymore. And so just a year after Luther published it, it was already being read and used in Denmark. And of course, certainly the scholars there could all read German and understand it. We know that at certain times when Christian was facing troubles of one kind or another, he actually corresponded with Luther, got counsel and advice from him and direction. So Christian II was very much attuned to the Reformation and what was going on there. However, at that time, the Danish king did not simply inherit the throne. He was elected by the Danish nobility. So when the nobles got together, they would decide actually who the next king was. Now, it couldn't just be anybody. It had to be someone out of the nobility. But it it made their hold on the throne a little less secure because they depended on the support of the nobles. Well, Christian had a really rough relationship with the Danish nobility. They did not get along very well at all. They didn't trust each other very much. And Christian kind of blew it in some ways. Some of his misadventures, he created a lot of trouble for himself by some of his misadventures. One outrageous episode is where he tried to cross over into Sweden and establish his authority there. For a time, Denmark had ruled a part of Sweden. It was ending right at this period. So he had gone over to try to assert his authority there, and it was just a disaster. Ended up being called the Stockholm Bloodbath that Christian II pulled off there. In fact, among the Swedes, he's still known as Christian the Tyrant rather than Christian II of Denmark. So in 1523, Christian was deposed by the nobles. They just sent him packing and put his uncle, King Frederick I, on the throne. And it's very interesting that as part of the deal to put Frederick on the throne, he had to agree to support Catholic teaching, to be loyal to Rome rather than to the Reformation, both in doctrine and in practice. But in actual reality, he tolerated all sorts of Lutheran influence and teaching and practice within the nation. Again, he encouraged the use of a Danish translation of the Bible that had been made in the meantime. And you maybe know that for the Roman Catholic Church, it was absolutely forbidden to have the Bible in anything but Latin. And part of the fear was that if you put it in the language of the people, they would misinterpret it and make a hash out of it and just get into all sorts of trouble. So there were people who were actually martyred for trying to put the Bible in the language of the people. My favorite story is John Wycliffe, who was one of the first ones to try to put the Bible in English. He died before they could martyr him, but a few years later they dug up his bones and burned those at the stake, just to be very clear that this was forbidden. So for King Frederick to say, yeah, go ahead, read the Bible in your own language, use this Danish translation, was remarkable. Almost, it really showed where his loyalties finally lay. He also cut off contact between the bishops of Denmark and Rome, the Roman Curia, the hierarchy there. Well, in the church, the bishops got their authority from Rome. So if you can't have any contact with them anymore, if you can't participate in what Rome is doing, basically, he is pushing the Reformation, just not officially in any way. Most amazingly, I think when Hans Tausen was accused of heresy, of false teaching, which was a good reason for martyrdom, I mean, that's why they would kill you, Frederick made Tausen his personal chaplain at the court to protect him. Because nobody's going to go after the king's personal chaplain unless the king decides he has to go. So he actually protected Tausen from charges of heresy because of his Lutheran teaching. Well, meanwhile, Christian II, who had been deposed, wanted the throne back. He was not willing just to ride off into the sunset. And so to appeal to the nobility, he first reconverted to Catholicism. I think you probably want to put scare quotes around reconverted. But a lot of this wasn't driven by faith. It was driven by power and wanting power and authority. So suddenly he becomes a Catholic again. And he went to Norway, then ruled by Denmark, of course, all part of one kingdom, to gain support. So that if the Norwegian nobles would support him, then he could get his influence back in Denmark and get back on the throne. But he was decisively defeated in the one great battle, and in fact put in prison for the rest of his life. So it was a bad bet for Christian II. But just 8 months after that was all settled, Frederick I died. Remember, he was Christian's uncle, so he was older. Although none of these guys lived to be very old. You know, if they hit 60, that was old age at that time. Well, so now who's going to take his place? The Catholic nobility favored his 12-year-old son, who came to be called Hans the Elder. Not because he was elderly, he was just the older child. But the Lutheran nobility, or the Lutheran party, favored his son from his first marriage, who was also named Christian, like Christian II. So it took 3 years of war to settle this. It was called the Counts' War, or the War of the Nobility, before most of the nobles finally coalesced behind Christian. And so he became King Christian III. Finally came to the throne in 1536, or at least he wasn't officially crowned until the next year, but that's when he basically came to power. And it only happened after he conquered Copenhagen. He actually had to go to war against the capital city, conquer it, and then he had the power to become king. Well, despite the work of Hans Tausen and this sort of under-the-radar work of Frederick, this is really the beginning of the Danish Reformation. Because now it's all open, it's above board, there isn't much opposition to it anymore. Now the gates are really open, starting in 1536. Now, Christian, before he was brought to the throne, had been the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein. This was his territory down in here. So he was right on the German border and had a lot of German influence, of course, on him. In that role as Duke of Schleswig-Holstein, he had heard Luther at the Diet of Worms. He was in the audience when Luther made his famous defense there. Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me, amen. And he had been a staunch Lutheran ever since. He even introduced it into his duchies. You know, you could get away with this as a local ruler. Even though the whole country wasn't there, your word was law within your own territory. So when he conquered Copenhagen in 1536, the first thing he did was to arrest all the Roman Catholic bishops. I mean, this was a big change that was coming. Now, his official reason was that they were hesitant to support him as king. And he couldn't have church leaders who weren't fully behind him. But he very likely had two other motivations as well, as did many of these rulers in this period. One was he simply wanted to replace them with Lutheran church leaders, but they had lifetime appointments. You had to get them off the scene somehow before you could put in Lutheran bishops in their place. But also, he very likely wanted to confiscate the Catholic bishop's property to help pay for his war. Now, this is one of the things that is not true anymore. We don't always remember it, but in the time of the Reformation, Roman Catholic bishops were like princes. They ruled territories, they had castles, they made money hand over fist. And that's why many people were willing to pay huge sums of money for a bishopric or an archbishopric, because it was like a license to print money. It was very, very influential. So to depose these three Catholic bishops, claim all their property for the crown, it was a windfall for Christian III. And this change with Christian, I think, shows the messiness of Reformation politics. At some level, it was about the faith. It was about the truth. And yet there's all this power and money and battles, involved to see who's going to end up on top. And you can't separate the two. I mean, it's just all mixed up together. So it is, in many ways, a kind of messy story in many of these places. So the kings and the nobles almost never had pure motives. Not even Frederick the Wise, who protected Luther. Frederick thought Luther was right, but he also had a profound desire to poke a stick in the Pope's eye. So, I mean, he protected Luther just to say, you know, I mean, there was very much a mixed motive there. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church had immense wealth that these kings coveted, because the kings were always short of money. Almost by definition, they were always short of money. There's one estimate that at the time of the Reformation, the church in Europe controlled a third to a half of all the property. I mean, can you imagine the church owning everything east of the Mississippi? It's just stunning, you know, how much property and wealth was tied up there. So that added to this messiness and the conflict between church and state. Well, back in 1528, so this is 8 years before he becomes king. Already in 1528, Christian had put Lutheran church orders in his duchies in Schleswig-Holstein. Church orders just means organizational documents for how the church is to run. Included liturgy, but also, you know, who's ordained, how they get ordained, who has the authority, you know, who makes the decisions. So he had already put Lutheran church orders in place in the areas he ruled. But now, or as he did so, those changes were summed up in a document called the Haderslev Articles. There were 22 of them that laid out how the church was going to run in a Lutheran way rather than under the authority of the Pope. Now, these don't quite rank up there with the Augsburg Confession. Most people have never heard of them. But they did lay a very important foundation for the Reformation in Denmark. Because when Christian III comes to the throne and he wants to make the whole nation Lutheran, he has the foundation already set. These articles have already been written, and he can just build off them. So starting now in 1536, Frederick III wanted to bring a similar kind of church orders to the whole nation, to all of Denmark. But interestingly, for such an important task, Christian, even though the Haderslev Articles were already there, Christian still looked outside of Denmark for help. And he had met a man named John Bugenhagen, or Johannes Bugenhagen, back in 1529. So just a year after he had started putting the church orders in place in Schleswig-Holstein. Bugenhagen, again, it's not a name that's well known, but he was a very significant figure in the Reformation. He was the pastor of the city church in Wittenberg, where Luther went to church. So he was Martin Luther's pastor for many years in Wittenberg. He was also a very close associate of Luther's and a friend of his. Bugenhagen helped Luther complete his translation of the Bible. You know, he famously did the whole New Testament by himself at the Wartburg in 1520-21. But Luther wasn't as good in Hebrew. That took a lot longer to do the Old Testament. And Bugenhagen was one of those who helped him do that much larger project of completing his translation of the Bible. Now, Bugenhagen was born in a place called Pomerania. The actual city is called Wallin, W-O-L-L-I-N. Makes me wonder if our own Pastor Dave also traces back to Pomerania, to Wallin. It's not impossible. That's where a lot of those names came from. But because of that, he had a nickname, Pomeranus, or sometimes just Palmer. Luther most often called him Palmer, just as rather, I suppose, shorter than Bugenhagen. But if you're reading things, you know, a book on Luther or something, you see that name Palmer, it's Bugenhagen, because of where he came from. He was a very popular preacher and pastor in Wittenberg. He had a kind of gift for explaining hard ideas, making them understandable. In 1533, he was one of the first three scholars to get a Lutheran Doctor of Theology degree. that is not one that was tied back to the Catholic universities, but out of Wittenberg and Lutheran teachers. One of the first to get that advanced degree. He was also, however, a little wordy. He was known for sort of preaching endlessly in the church in Wittenberg. There's a story about a man who had come home from church. Why his wife didn't go with him, I don't know, if that was common practice. But he had come home from church and dinner wasn't ready. And his wife apologized. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I thought Dr. Palmer was preaching today." So I had a lot more time to get ready and to be prepared. So anyhow. Bugenhagen was also known as a great organizer. He was an effective leader. He organized many churches in areas of northern Germany, up in that area, from Schleswig-Holstein, Bremen, Hamburg, all of that area. In fact, it earned him another nickname. He was called the second apostle to the north. The first, of course, being those who brought the Christian faith there. But now as he brings the Reformation and reorganizes these churches under Lutheran teaching, they call him the second apostle to the north. Well, because Christian III knows Bugenhagen, because of his reputation, he wrote to Wittenberg's ruler. Frederick the Wise has died. It's now John Frederick, who is the Duke of Electoral Saxony, and asked him to send either Bugenhagen or Philip Melanchthon to Denmark to help establish the Lutheran Church there. And interestingly, John Frederick at first refused. Wouldn't do it. He only agreed to send one of these guys after the Danish theologians had done a lot of the groundwork, had provided a rough draft of a Danish Lutheran church order. Apparently just wanted his guys to go in there and put the cherry on the cake rather than to have to do all of the work. May have been concerned about political complications there too. We don't know for sure. But all of these Danish theologians had studied at Wittenberg, so they sort of knew what they were getting. It wasn't that it was really up in the air at that point. So by April of 1537, a year after Christian III came to power, this draft order for the Lutheran Church in Denmark was finished. And interestingly, they sent it to Wittenberg for approval. Now, normally the king has absolute authority. And in these European nations, once the Reformation came in place, the king was the head of the church. And that Christian III doesn't quite feel authorized to give this the final imprimatur, the final approval. So he sends it off to Wittenberg instead to make sure that it passes muster. And then John Frederick allowed Bugenhagen to come to Copenhagen. So Bugenhagen comes to Copenhagen. It sort of fits, you know, there's sort of a rhyme to that, a sort of rhythm to his going to Denmark. He was supposed to stay there only for a few months, again, just to sort of tie up the bow and finish this off. But very typical for him, he stayed way longer than planned. And he did this several times. When he went to these northern areas to try to organize the church, he'd always be gone 2, 3, 4 times longer than he thought. Well, while he's away, guess who's covering all of his duties at the city church? Martin Luther. And we read in Luther's letters these endless complaints about Palmer being gone and how he's being worked to death. And is he ever going to come back and take over his job again? And probably Luther had a fair complaint. You know, I mean, he had enough to do without covering for Bugenhagen for months and years on end while he was tooling around Denmark or in other places. Well, Bugenhagen did oversee the revisions and the final draft of these new church orders, so that now the Danish church was organized under the Reformation, not under Rome. Beyond that, though, Bugenhagen crowned Christian III as king, and his wife Dorothea as queen. And on August 12, 1537, in a Lutheran ritual. He also installed new Lutheran church superintendents They didn't use the word bishop, at least not for a while. They're superintendents instead, as leaders of the Danish church. And not only that, but in the same year, he reopened the University of Copenhagen after making sure that the faculty was sufficiently Lutheran and under the Reformation, so that this teaching would not be undermined going forward. Now, I find it just stunning that a foreign theologian, a German from Wittenberg, would be granted this kind of authority in Denmark to crown the king. But there is a kind of logic to this, because previously, before the Reformation, very often kings were crowned by the Pope or one of the Pope's representatives, because the church was thought to be of a higher authority than any of these nations, so you would be crowned by the Pope. Well, they're not going to do that in our Lutheran circle, so what's the next best thing? Somebody from Wittenberg. Apparently couldn't get Luther himself to show up, so Bugenhagen serves the role. It's a sense that, that Christian III's rule has divine authority to it. The church approves of his being on the throne. So these new church orders were signed by Christian III on September 2nd, 1537, and poof, just like that, Denmark was Lutheran. I mean, literally overnight. Yeah, it had been building and the foundation was being laid, but the actual switch was a single decision by the king. You were Catholic, now you're Lutheran. Congratulations. I mean, that's the way it worked. The 7 Roman Catholic bishops in Denmark had all been replaced now by Lutheran superintendents instead. But this was much more of a royal coup than a grassroots movement that had built up. But again, that wasn't unusual in Europe at the time. In fact, in Germany, where they had these wars, the Schmalkaldic Wars and others over the Reformation, with Catholic nobility fighting Lutheran nobility, the Holy Roman Emperor was on the Catholic side, wars went on for a number of years. The way they finally settled that was on exactly the model that Christian III used in Denmark. They adopted this phrase in Latin. It says, "Cuius regio, eius religio," which translates roughly, who's the realm, his the religion. So the duke or the count or whoever just decided. But it was very territorial. It wasn't in personal conviction. It was, if you lived here, you're a Catholic, and if you live there, you're a Lutheran. Because the ruler got to decide, the ruler of the territory. This, incidentally, is why McLeod County is crawling with German Lutherans, and Stearns County is packed with German Catholics. You just trace it back to where the immigrants came from. If they came from a Lutheran part of Germany, they brought their Lutheranism with them. If they came from a Catholic part of Germany, they brought their Catholicism with them. So they're all German immigrants, but this basic divide goes back to the rule that in order to stop fighting about this, we're just going to let the ruler decide. Of his particular area, everybody there is one or the other. No mixing it up. Well, under Denmark's new church orders, the king, King Christian III, was to have no theological authority. So he wasn't to mess in the church anymore, the way that, for example, Henry VIII had in England. They weren't going to do any of that. But at the same time, the superintendents, again replacing the bishops, they were not to hold land, as the Roman Catholic bishops had, these vast estates that belonged to the bishopric. Nor were they to hold any kind of secular office. So if you were a superintendent, you couldn't, serve as foreign minister or something. They're starting to separate church and state a little bit, at least formally. And that was, again, a reaction against the practice of the Roman Catholic bishops, who had, many of them could hardly be distinguished from princes with the kind of authority and the glamour and the wealth and everything that went along with it. But the truth is, these rules were often violated from both sides in lots of ways. The king did stick his nose in church affairs. The superintendents did know how to, get their finger in the pie. So it wasn't neat and clean. But they're starting to divvy that up and to create some lines of separation there. Now, the new church orders also reversed or revised many other Catholic practices and traditions to put them more in a Reformation mindset. But one of the things that was actually positive about the Reformation in Denmark is that while the decision was overnight, the changes were sort of introduced and adopted slowly. They had the wisdom not just to come in and impose something brand new on all these parishes in Denmark, where you had largely uneducated peasants saying, what the heck, what's going on here? But slowly, sort of step by step, they introduced new Lutheran teaching and practice. And that prevented a lot of resistance and even bloodshed that you saw in other places, like in areas of Germany. Well, Bugenhagen left Denmark in 1539, so he was there for 2 years. But he returned again in 1542 because the project wasn't really done yet. The Reformation hadn't really been established all through the country. And ironically, one of the places it hadn't been fully implemented was Schleswig-Holstein, the place Christian had come from, where he first introduced some of this stuff way back in 1528, but 14 years later, they still didn't quite have it. So he comes back to Denmark to sort of, again, finish the job and get that Lutheran church firmly established all the way through Denmark. Well, as you can imagine, this royal imposition of the Reformation in Denmark had some strengths, and it had some weaknesses as well. The strengths, of course, is that because it came on high, there was very little conflict or resistance or bloodshed. And it's not only that the peasants weren't willing, but when you live in a monarchy, it's just sort of banged into your head that you don't challenge what your Lord says or what the king says. You just go with it. And so if the king said it, then there just wasn't much resistance or much conflict about it. It also meant, of course, that it didn't take among the people immediately, but these new superintendents did make sure that sound doctrine was brought into these churches. They made sure the pastors at least were trained, that they were teaching the small catechism, that they were grounding the people in Reformation teaching. And so within a generation or two, the Danish churches and people were solidly Lutheran. It just didn't happen overnight. But there are also some weaknesses involved in here. One of which is that the Danish church was far too identified with the king and the nation. One of the interesting things, even in this country, is among the Danish immigrants, how much the faith was tied to their Danishness. We see that in other immigrant churches too, but it was really strong among these Danish immigrants, particularly in the Church of the Happy Danes. We'll talk about that in another week, but their emphasis on culture and language and folk songs and all of that, the folk schools, was almost indistinguishable from the gospel. Those two went hand in hand. But because this was sort of imposed on high, it was also heavily mixed with, the church easily became kind of formality. It's like, well, this is the hoop I have to jump through, so I'll jump through it. And because it didn't, rise up, bubble up from the bottom where people were really convinced of these things, it was like, oh, now we're hearing something different. It didn't necessarily take as deep a root as it might have in a place like Wittenberg, where the people were first convinced of it and then had to kind of fight for it. This is imposed from on high, and so it tended to become in many places, a kind of formality, more so than a zealous conviction for Christ. And that led to some issues within the Danish church as you go forward. And it had a direct effect on the Danish immigrants who came to this country. So when we gather next time, we'll look at the 19th century situation of the church in Denmark, because that's what the immigrants brought with them. That's what directly affected how they looked at and tried to handle and build the church in this country. But what's going on in the 19th century grows directly out of what was going on here in the Reformation. All right. Well, I apologize for the lightly controlled chaos outside. I'm not sure what was going on in Sunday school today. It's usually not that wild, but we'll hope for a little more peace and quiet next time. But we'll pick up on that, the situation in the church at the time the immigrants started coming.
You have called to us the